Welcome to the first series. It's Buildings the Bricks of Beliefs. As you know, Sri Lanka team in 1995 slowly started winning outside of Sri Lanka. They just had a test series win in New Zealand and they won a one-day series and the test series in Pakistan. But the bilateral series are good, but the multi-nation formats are a totally different gravy. We're going to see what happened in Sharjah and the Singer Sharjah Cup and how this tournament instilled belief in the Sri Lankan cricket team, which actually transformed in the 1996 World Cup campaign. As the first part of this video, we are going to talk about two important innings played by Roshan Mahanama and Hashan Tilakaratne. And we are going to see why those two innings are so significant in terms of building the backbone of the batting or the stability in the Sri Lankan cricket team batting lineup going forward to the 1996 World Cup.
As you correctly pointed out, the Sharjah Cup was critical for many reasons in the build-up towards the World Cup, and the contributions of Roshan Mahanama and Hashan Tilakaratne were two critical components which we cannot overlook. Now, if you look at the success of the Sri Lankan team in the 1996 World Cup, we speak about Sanath Jayasuriya and Romesh Kalavitarne, we speak about Aravinda and Arjuna, and we also speak about Asanka Gurusinghe. But two people who are often overlooked in the background are Roshan Mahanama and Hashan Tilakaratne, because if you really look at the approach of the Sri Lankan team, you would realize that Sri Lanka were able to go all out at the top and have a free-flowing approach throughout the innings. In case of Aravinda and Arjuna as well, during the middle phases of the innings, was the assurance or the security they had, thinking that Hashan Tilakaratne and Roshan Mahanama will bail them out of situations if there was a need. And in fact, during the World Cup, at critical moments, these two came to the fore, not in exorbitant manners, but in their own unique way, providing stability, which contributed towards the success of the Sri Lankan team during the 1996 World Cup. But to do so in a big tournament, you need to have the belief, or you need to showcase your capabilities somewhere else. And that for me was the Sharjah Cup in 1995, which we are talking about right now, which was against West Indies and Pakistan. So if you look at the run-up to the Sharjah Cup, this is beautifully described in the book by Nicholas Brooks, The Islands 11, where Roshan Mahanama's run-up to the Sharjah Cup, or towards the latter part of 1995, despite Sri Lanka's fortunes being on the rise, was not that great. But when it came to the Sharjah Cup, Roshan Mahanama, at the top of the order, contributed immensely towards the success of this tournament, where he scored a century, 2 half centuries, and then an unbeaten knock in a winning cause against Pakistan, and ended up scoring 288 runs in 4 games, if I remember right, because he missed one game, if I remember right, against Pakistan, which was the second league game. And that is massive. 288 runs from your opening batter or experienced batter is absolutely phenomenal, even in today's context. And he started the series off with a century against West Indies and finished the series off with a 66 in the final. So this kind of a turnaround in fortunes for Roshan Mahanama was critical, because when Sri Lanka went into the Australian tour and whatever that followed there, and thereafter into the World Cup, they knew that one of their most senior batters were in good form. So this was a critical element in the build-up towards the World Cup. But also at the same time, Hashan Tilakaratne is another critical player we often overlook. And in my opinion, Hashan played one of the innings of the 1990s for Sri Lanka, because we talk about the exploits of Aravinda De Silva, we talk about the exploits of Sanath Jayasuriya, and we talk about many other great knocks. But when it came to the third league game for Sri Lanka against West Indies, they had won one game in the first round and lost one game, so the third game was critical. They had to win that game to be in contention for the finals, or at least compete, so that even if they'd lost, they had an opportunity going into the last game versus Pakistan. So to provide context to that game, if you go back and look at that game versus West Indies, which was the third game of the league for Sri Lanka, Brian Lara had scored 169 runs. Now, to understand the magnitude of that, you should remember that at that point in time, if I remember right, the highest individual ODI score belonged to Sir Vivian Richards, and he had 181 or 188, something of that sort, if my memory serves me right. So Brian Lara scored 169 runs, and West Indies scored 330 odd runs batting first. And within a blink of an eye, obviously when you have such a big score to chase, you go after that, and Sri Lanka kept losing wickets at regular intervals. At one point, they lost 7 wickets for 160 odd runs. So you haven't got even 50% of the target, and you had lost 7 wickets. So basically what that meant was Sri Lanka were almost about to receive the knockout punch. But despite of that, I think with the contributions from the lower order, especially Chandika Hathurusinghe, who was batting lower down the order, Hashan Tilakaratne played one of the best knocks that Sri Lanka has seen in the 1990s, often forgotten, often not spoken about, where he scored 100 runs at almost a strike rate of 100 and brought Sri Lanka to a stage where when it came to the last over, Sri Lanka required 5 runs off 4 balls with 1 wicket in hand. And he had just notched up his 100, and I think the vibes were so good. Nobody was expecting Sri Lanka to put up such a fight back, and nobody was expecting Hashan Tilakaratne, a typical test batter, to play that type of a knock and to bring Sri Lanka back from the brink of a loss to almost an assured win. Because when you need to score 5 runs off 4 balls, you are just 1 hit away. And everybody thought that hit came because the moment the game ended, of the last ball, which turned out to be the last ball, it was a leg side full toss. I can't remember who the bowler was. Hashan played it towards deep square leg, and those days the cameras were not great, or maybe the camera work was not great. So the camera shifted towards the boundary line, and it almost appeared as if the ball had gone for a 6. And I think, if I remember right, it was Tony Greig who was on commentary, and he said it has gone for 6 or something on those lines. So you almost think that Sri Lanka has pulled off a miraculous victory against West Indies, who were quite strong. And that too with a last ball 6. Now Sarja is known for last ball 6s. Javid Miandad 6 in an India-Pakistan game is eternally etched in cricketing folklore. And one would have thought Hashan also went into that echelon, but unfortunately it was actually theatrical, because all of a sudden from the vacant boundary line where the camera was focusing, in dusky, like darkness of the evening, this Stuart Williams, who was the opening batter for West Indies, emerges with a beaming smile, having caught the ball. And even to date, I have concerns, or probably the angles were not great, but I think there are some videos on YouTube. If you go back and see, you will realize that there's an element which tells you that maybe the fielder stepped onto the boundary. So Sri Lanka fell short by 4 runs, but it was Hashan's knock which made almost the impossible possible on the back of a thrashing. And that splurge at the end, or the resurgence at the end, enabled Sri Lanka to be in contention for the finals and instilled confidence. So I think, I'm pretty sure at the end of a game like that, when your number 7 batter comes in and plays a knock like that, you believe that you can go on to achieve greater things. And so in that context, the contribution of Roshan Mahanama throughout the series, where he went on to score nearly 300 runs and end up as the man of the series, and Hashan's that knock at a critical moment, were pivotal factors which we cannot deny played a major part in boosting the confidence of the Sri Lankan team as a unit, and gave them the security, cushion, insurance, or whatever we might like to call it, going into Australia and also into the World Cup to try out an innovative approach, which was a high-risk approach. And in that context, this tournament was critical, and the contribution of Hashan and Roshan, and probably the turnaround in fortunes and performance, cannot be overlooked in the broader context of how Sri Lankan cricket proceeded.
We have seen how those individual performances instilled the belief in those players and the teams. Now we are going to see certain outcomes of the matches. The results of those matches went Sri Lanka's way, almost in Sri Lanka's way, because Sri Lanka almost pulled off a chase of 300 plus score. Mind you, this is 1995, a big deal, and almost blown one of the opposition below 200 and comprehensively won those matches. Now, Ara, tell me, how much these results instill the belief that we can chase that much, we can bowl out the opposition this much, and how much these kind of results go a long way when it comes a team which is on building phases of going forward to a big tournament.
As you correctly highlighted, Indushan, during the intro of this series, you mentioned that it was a critical tournament for Sri Lanka to answer questions as to whether they were competition worthy when they came against heavyweights. So, West Indies and Pakistan, if you look at that, those lineups that took up to this series, those were near first 11 lineups that were going to play the 1996 World Cup. So basically, Sri Lanka, despite having a good track record, were outsiders when it came into this series. But how this series progressed, despite the strength of West Indies and Pakistan, who had players like, for example, if you looked at Pakistan, they had Inzamam ul Haq, Ramiz Raja, Amir Sohail, Waqar Yunis, Mushtaq Ahmed. So these were key players in their setup, and West Indies had Richard Richardson, Phil Simmons, Brian Lara, and quite a few others, and all top-notch players. So there was no question about the strength of the opponents, but the most critical aspect was how Sri Lanka would fare in a tournament like this. So if you look at that tournament, there were key things which actually stood out for me. In the first game, Sri Lanka had scored 228, and this was obviously a very decent score in that time, but the West Indies scored about 165 for 2 in about 40 overs. So despite requiring 70 runs with the likes of Sherwin Campbell, Richie Richardson at the crease and at their disposal, West Indies would have backed themselves to win that game. But Sri Lankan spinners made sure that, they choked the West Indies, came back from behind, and edged them out for a 6-run victory. So now West Indies at that point were a very strong team. For a team like Sri Lanka to come from behind and win a game like that, which was closely contested by a margin of just 6 runs, was significant, and they got off to a good start in the tournament. But having got off to a good start, in the next game they got an absolute pummeling by Pakistan, where I think they lost by around 80 runs, which would have dented their net run rate or the possibilities of going into the finals. But then when they moved into the third game, which was against West Indies again, they conceded 333. The heroics of Hashan Tilakaratne, which I mentioned previously, came to Sri Lanka's rescue, and somewhat they were staying afloat. But mind you, when they went into the fourth game, they had lost 2 games and won just 1 game heading into the final game, which basically meant that Sri Lanka had to win the game against Pakistan, and the net run rate was definitely would have been in the equation. And they came in with such a magnificent performance where they bundled out Pakistan for less than 150 and went on to win the game comprehensively by 5 or 6 wickets with so much of ease, securing a place in the final. And one of the key highlights of that game, I think, against Pakistan was that if you see who was the man of the match in that game, it was Arjuna Ranatunga. And Arjuna Ranatunga had not batted in that game, and he won that man of the match award for his bowling, where he picked 2 wickets for 20-odd runs, bowling his full quota of 10 overs. So these kind of little things where, in a keenly contested series against 2 top-notch nations, Sri Lanka held their nerve, and having faced back-to-back losses, one a close one, another one a pummeling, to come back and comprehensively beat Pakistan and secure a place in the final was critical in the run-up to the final. But once you come to a final, as you correctly said, the bilateral series are a different cup of tea, and multi-nation tournaments are a different cup of tea. So now they were up against West Indies, against whom they had won 1 game and lost a close one. Both the games were close games. They won by 6 runs and had lost by 4 runs. So how would they fare in the final was a question in everybody's mind. And Sri Lanka left no stone untouched as they put in a comprehensive performance in the final and went on to score about 270 runs, which was an absolute match-winning score in that era, where the Sri Lankan top order, Roshan Mahanama scored a 50, Hashan, Sanath Jayasuriya scored a 50, and I think it was in this game that he smacked about 2 or 3 sixers, showing what was to follow in the next few months to come. And I'm pretty sure that nobody would have had an iota of idea the magnitude with which Sanath would come back to haunt other opponents in the next few months. And Aravinda played a scintillating knock. I think it was a runner ball or a better than runner ball knock, and he flayed the West Indian bowlers to all parts of the ground and pumped Sri Lanka up to 270. And after scoring 270, there was no question of Sri Lanka going back and losing that game. It was a comprehensive all-round performance, and Sri Lanka emerged as the champions in the Saja Cup 1995 against West Indies and Pakistan. So that type of a victory, it was just not a mere victory, but a hard-fought victory where they had to hold their nerves against strong opponents, and different players had to come and contribute in different forms. Aravinda de Silva contributed in the finals, Roshan Mahanama contributed throughout, Arjuna contributed in his own way, Hashan had a meaningful impact, the bowlers in their own way came up and delivered when it was required. So Sri Lanka were up and running, and with the World Cup to follow in their own conditions, in subcontinental conditions within few months, beating Pakistan and West Indies, who were one of the front runners for the 1996 World Cup, would have boosted their confidence a massive deal and should be considered a significant component in the wall, or probably a significant brick that built the wall of belief for Sri Lanka going into the 1996 World Cup.